What is up, besties, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Scotty Holiday, a queer creator and a huge Star Wars nerd, so if you're into either one of those things, please consider liking, subscribing, and following me on social media at Scotty Holiday SW for all my latest Star Wars content. For those who don't already know, on top of my love for Star Wars, I also love all things spooky. If you haven't noticed already, I'm usually always wearing like a spooky or horror t-shirt, something black, the aesthetic. I thought it would be really fun to combine my love for the two and rank the scariest aspects of Star Wars. So in this video, I'm going to be ranking all things that go bump in the night in a galaxy far, far away. And you're going to want to make sure you stay until the very end because this list gets absolutely terrifying. Now, starting off my list at number 10, I have Force Ghosts. So Force Ghosts have been around since 1980, with the first appearing in The Empire Strikes Back. Putting ourselves in Luke's shoes in the film, seeing a version of your deceased Jedi Master for the first time since their death has to be a little scary, or at least a little startling, and that's why I have Force Ghosts on this list. I couldn't talk about spooky things in Star Wars without mentioning ghosts, and since Obi-Wan Kenobi's first Force Ghost appearance in Episode 5, we've now seen the Force Ghosts of Yoda, Anakin, Luke, Leia, and Qui-Gon Jinn throughout the years in various Star Wars media. Next, at number 9, we have Resurrection. And so far in Star Wars media, we've actually seen two characters resurrected on screen, with the first being Ahsoka Tano. During the Clone Wars, after being transported to the realm of Mortis and encountering the Force wielders, known as the Son, the Daughter, and the Father, the Son, who's aligned with the dark side of the Force, captures Ahsoka and infects her with the dark side, using her as bait in an attempt to get Anakin to join him. Of course, Anakin refuses, causing the corrupted Ahsoka to attack him and eventually Obi-Wan as well when he and the daughter arrive. At the end of the ordeal, once the Son decides Ahsoka is no longer of any use to him, he drains her life force, instantly killing her, and then attempts to kill the father. However, the daughter, who is aligned with the light side of the Force, sacrifices herself, taking the Son's mortal blow. Horrified with his actions, the Son flees, and the daughter uses her remaining life force to bring Ahsoka back to life. The only other time we've seen a character resurrected is in The Rise of Skywalker, when Ben Solo uses his remaining life force to bring Rey back to life after she defeated Palpatine on Exegol. These examples of resurrection aren't necessarily scary, but the act of resurrection in itself goes against the will of the Force, and that's what makes it such a taboo topic. Moving on to number 8, I have Sith spirits. And I know this is a controversial topic since George Lucas was against the idea altogether, nevertheless, I had to include them on my list. Some examples of Sith spirits we've seen in canon Star Wars media include Yoda's encounter with Darth Bane in the Clone Wars Season 6, the Grand Inquisitor in the 2020 Star Wars comic series, and Darth Momin from the 2017 Darth Vader comics. There were also plans to include the spirits of Darth Bane and Darth Revan in the Clone Wars series on Mortis as advisors to the Son, but they were ultimately cut late in production. I think what makes Sith spirits so scary is that, unlike Force ghosts, they'll never be at peace, and in the examples I mentioned previously, each Sith is tied to a location or object for eternity, doomed to never be free of their pain, nor move on to the afterlife. Plus, their depictions in both the Clone Wars series and the comics have been pretty unsettling as well. Now, at number 7, I have Creatures of the Galaxy. The Star Wars galaxy is filled with millions of different creatures, but I want to talk about the ones I find truly terrifying. Starting off at the beginning, we have the Dianoga. First appearing in Episode 4, Dianoga are large, sentient, squid-like creatures, with some even being sensitive to the Force. What makes these creatures so scary are their long tentacles, singular eye, and sharp teeth. Now, we all remember the trash compactor scene from A New Hope, and before the walls even began to contract, the thalassophobia created from the Dianoga was enough to make my skin crawl. Star Wars revisited this theme of terrifying creatures of the deep again in The Phantom Menace, but this time on a much larger and much more frightening scale.
There's always a bigger fish.
The planet of Tatooine is also home to some pretty scary creatures, including the Sarlacc, which needs no introduction, and the even more terrifying Krayt Dragon as seen in Mando Season 2. Star Wars is also not afraid to dabble in arachnophobia, with creatures such as the Krykna in Rebels, the knobby white ice spiders from Mando Season 2, and Kashyyyk's Wyshock spiders from Jedi Fallen Order. The Rise of Skywalker introduced us to the Eye of the Webbish Bog, a spider-like being that's locked in symbiosis with a blind giant, and I've always found it to be very unsettling in appearance. But the creature that terrified me the most is the cyborg scavenger from the Mandalorian Season 3 episode, The Mines of Mandalore. Between its gigantic singular eye, distorted vocalization, spinal spikes, centipede-like legs, plus the fact that it drains the blood of its victims, it only gets worse and worse as the episode goes on. You could even consider this creature a form of body horror, but that's a topic we'll save for later on in the video. So this brings me to my next entry, and at number 6, we have possession. Now, throughout Star Wars, we've seen many different types of possession through the use of masks, magic, and even brainworms. I think what makes possession so scary is that a possessed person loses all autonomy of their mind and body, with someone or something else taking over. As I mentioned before, we've seen this happen with the Mask of Darth Moment in the 2017 Darth Vader comics, with the Sith Lord being able to possess the body of any being that came into close proximity with the mask. In the Clone Wars Season 2 episode Brain Invaders, we get an entire episode dedicated to Geonosian brainworms possessing the minds of multiple clones, as well as Padawan Barriss Offee in an attempt to gain control of their vessel mid-hyperspace travel, similar to something you'd see in a sci-fi horror film such as Alien. In the episode, it ends up falling on Ahsoka alone to rid the clones and Barriss of the worms' control before their ship arrives at the Republic medical station, where the worms could then unleash themselves on the entire galaxy. We also saw Sabine Wren and Kanan Jarrus possessed for a short time by the spirits of dead nightsisters on Dathomir in Star Wars Rebels Season 3. Possession is a huge horror staple in our world, and the following entries only get better or worse depending on how you look at it from here. At number 5, we have zombies, and there's a surprising amount of zombies in Star Wars canon. We got our first zombie entry in the Star Wars universe via the Clone Wars Season 2 episode Legacy of Terror with Geonosian zombies. Throughout the episode, we discovered that the Geonosian zombies are being controlled by the previously mentioned brainworms, but I still wanted to include them since this was Star Wars canon's first dip into the horror subgenre. The Clone Wars also brought back zombies for Season 4, but this time with Nightsister zombies. In the episode, we see Mother Talzin call on the Nightsister elder, Old Daka, to raise the dead Nightsisters in an effort to repeal the Separatist army on Dathomir. We also see Merrin reanimate dead Nightsisters in Jedi Fallen Order and dead prisoners in the book Jedi Battle Scars. Most recently in the Ahsoka series, we saw reanimated Stormtrooper and Death Trooper zombies through the use of Nightsister magic as well. Though they were pretty scary in the Clone Wars series, Jedi Fallen Order really took Star Wars zombies up a notch, having them chase and swarm you multiple times while exploring the planet Dathomir, and that's why I have them at number 5 on my list. Next, at the number 4 spot, I have torture. And throughout Star Wars media, we've seen a lot of torture, from electric to sonic, physical, mental, and even force-based torture. I could make a whole separate video talking about torture in Star Wars, but for this list, I want to talk about the darkest and scariest torture the galaxy has to offer. Interrogation droids have been a thing since episode 4, and I'll never forget the dread I felt as a kid seeing Vader enter Leia's holding cell on the Death Star with the ITO interrogation droid, and then the slow zoom on the needle protruding from it. Another common torture tactic in Star Wars is the use of the interrogation chair, but the scariest use of this tool seems to take place in the Fortress Inquisitorius. The game Jedi Fallen Order brilliantly showed us the terror of the interrogation chair via Force Vision, putting us in the perspective of the Second Sister during her torture at the hands of the Inquisitorius. The Inquisitorius were also known to use dismemberment as a form of torture, with the Ninth Sister saying, "Once you've already lost yourself, a limb's easy," which really puts things into perspective for all that the Inquisitors went through behind closed doors, and we even got a further look into the organization and their torture tactics more recently in the book Inquisitor: Rise of the Red Blade. The Andor series also gave us an extremely dark and horrifying look into sonic torture in the Season 1 episode Nobody's Listening. In this episode, the character Bix is taken into Imperial custody and forced to listen to recordings of agonizing cries of dying children in an attempt to coerce her into revealing information. Not only is this form of torture extremely dark since the recordings were taken from the Empire's genocide of the Dysonite people, but Dr. Gorst, the mind behind the method, treats this form of torture as something scientific and experimental, adding an extremely unsettling presence to the already unnerving sequence. Of course, I have to mention Force-based torture as well, with the scariest and most evasive being mind-probing. Similarly, we can't forget Bor Gullet from Rogue One and his ability to invade people's minds against their will, leaving them in a state of incoherent madness afterwards. The idea of someone or something being able to peer inside your mind, going through all your thoughts, emotions, and memories against your will is honestly so terrifying, and that's why I have it at my number 4 spot on the list. Moving on to number 3, we have magic. Now, magic in the Star Wars universe is another aspect of the Force, usually channeled through the dark side, and there's absolutely no way I could do a spooky Star Wars video without mentioning the Nightsisters and their magic. Since their on-screen debut in the Clone Wars Season 3, we've seen Nightsisters use their magic to reanimate the dead and practice spellcasting, including possession, voodoo, teleportation, invisibility, physical enhancements, and so much more. Outside of the Nightsister zombies, I think the scariest depiction of Nightsister magic we've seen would probably have to be in Jedi Fallen Order when Merrin uses her magic to bury Taron Malicos alive. Believe it or not, the Nightsisters and their magic were the only power to truly rival the power of the Sith, and in the Son of Dathomir comic series, we learn that Mother Talzin, leader of the Nightsisters during the Clone Wars era, was the only person Darth Sidious considered a true rival. So while the Nightsisters may be the witches of the Star Wars universe, they're not the only group to practice magic. The Sith also have their own form of magic called Sith alchemy, and while we haven't seen it explored a ton in canon, we have seen it performed in both the Clone Wars Season 6 episode Sacrifice and the Star Wars Rebels Season 4 episode A World Between Worlds. In the Clone Wars, we see Darth Sidious and Count Dooku use Sith alchemy to attack Yoda during his journey to the ancient Sith world Moraband, creating an illusion of Sifo Dyas and later dueling him along with Anakin Skywalker in a vision. In Star Wars Rebels, we see Darth Sidious using Sith alchemy again, but this time to peer into the World Between Worlds, attempting to find a way in through the capture of Ezra Bridger and Ahsoka Tano. In both series, we see Palpatine's Sith alchemy characterized by blue, smoky flames, and though we have yet to see the flames in live action, Sith alchemy was also used in The Rise of Skywalker by the metalsmith Albrecht to repair Kylo Ren's helmet. Now for number 2, I have the dark side. I don't think I have to explain why the dark side is so scary, but I want to talk about some of the scariest abilities a practitioner of the dark side can perform. Star Wars Episode 4 first introduced us to the dark side with the character Darth Vader, and with his introduction came the introduction of the Force Choke. The fact that a Darksider is able to kill someone using nothing but their mind is frightening in itself, and seeing it used for the first time in A New Hope was equally as shocking as it was terrifying. Another scary dark side ability we see throughout Star Wars media is Force Lightning. Not only do we see Force Lightning used as a form of torture, but it's also capable of disfiguring and even killing the person it's directed at. Ultimately, I think the scariest dark side ability is the ability to keep oneself alive or cheat death. In the Clone Wars series, we learn that Maul survived being cut in half during his duel with Obi-Wan on Naboo solely using the dark side of the Force. We also learn that Darth Sidious survived being thrown down a reactor shaft and the explosion of the Death Star, using the dark side to transfer his consciousness into a cloned body all the way in the unknown regions on the planet Exegol. Not only are practitioners of the dark side usually evil, but they also refuse to die, and that's what makes the dark side so scary. I mean, the dark side of the Force and its users literally go against the very nature of the Force, continuously trying to bend it to their will, and it's no wonder why Palpatine says the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. Users of the dark side fuel their power with anger, hate, and the desire to cause pain and suffering, but at the end of the day, the dark side and the power it grants is really just a prison. You can't tell me this ain't some scary stuff. And finally, at the number 1 spot, I have body horror. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the horror subgenre, body horror intentionally showcases grotesque or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body, typically pushing the physical form of its subjects to their natural limits and beyond, and we actually see a lot more of this in Star Wars than you may realize. Now, Star Wars is no stranger to cybernetics between Luke's hand, Anakin's arm, and even more recently with Fennec Shand and the mods. You could technically consider Star Wars cybernetics a form of body horror, but the first and most easily recognizable example is Darth Vader himself. Throughout episode 4, Darth Vader's suit is easily perceived as just that, a suit, but it's not until episode 5 that we get a peek at the man beneath, eventually learning that he requires the suit to survive by the conclusion of the original trilogy. It wasn't until episode 3 that we were shown the events that actually lead to the necessity of Vader's suit, his cybernetics, and the extent of his injuries at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi. The entire final sequence of Anakin becoming Darth Vader from Revenge of the Sith is body horror to a T, and Star Wars even doubled down on Vader body horror in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, showing Vader literally being put back together. Something about seeing the cybernetic pieces implanted into his body, and the visuals of the mechanical arms and legs piercing into what's left of his appendages was really unnerving to watch and made my skin crawl. Darth Vader isn't our only Star Wars body horror villain though. You could argue that General Grievous's appearance is a form of body horror as well. Seeing his sack of organs encased in his mostly mechanical form always made me feel so uncomfortable. In both General Grievous and Vader's case, their cybernetic upgrades weren't really upgrades at all, but more of a mechanical prison, and that's what makes their appearance and existence truly horrifying. Another case of cybernetic body horror actually appears in the Clone Wars Season 7 with the discovery and rescue of the clone Echo in the second episode. Other forms of body horror in Star Wars include the Bomar monk droids, which were the spider-like droids that held the transplanted brains of enlightened monks in nutrient-filled jars, the clones and cloning in general, with the clone army, the abandoned Kaminoan clones on Borovio, Moff Gideon's clones in the Mandalorian, and the Snoke clones on Exegol. Even Palpatine himself in The Rise of Skywalker existing in a decaying clone body, being kept to life by various wires and tubes, and mobilized by a mechanical spine is body horror. We also have Spider-Maul in the Clone Wars Season 3, and last but certainly not least, what I consider the most disturbing and egregious example of body horror in Star Wars is the Decraniated. The Decraniated were an order of servants produced by Dr. Evazan, you know, this guy.
I don't like you either.
By abducting victims and removing all, if not the majority of their heads, replacing it with cybernetics to completely strip them of their identities, making them as subservient as droids, and selling them as servants. Of course, all of this was done against their will as well. I will never forget how uncomfortable I felt the first time I saw one appear on screen in Solo: A Star Wars Story, and ever since, I try to avoid looking at them altogether because the longer I look, the more unsettling their appearance becomes, to the point where I start feeling nauseous. So I guess it's no surprise that I have body horror in my #1 spot. I know most people usually rank the dark side or the Sith as their #1, but the reason I chose body horror on top of everything I just explained is because unlike using the dark side or becoming a Sith, body horror in Star Wars is usually always done without the victim's consent, and the idea of being turned into a cybernetic being against my will, losing any to every degree of my autonomy and humanity, is way more terrifying than anything else. I'd much rather be force choked to death than live out my days trapped in a mechanical prison, or in a shell of my former self, void of any identity or the characteristics that make me, me. But what did you think of my ranking, and what do you think is the scariest aspect of Star Wars? Let me know down in the comments below or join my Discord to continue the conversation together. Make sure to like, subscribe, and consider following me on social media at ScottyHolidaySW for all my latest Star Wars content. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, may the Force be with you.